You've probably seen situations where someone comes up with a quick fix for a problem, something messy, temporary, and expensive just because it solves things right away. And then that temporary fix sticks around way longer than expected, sometimes even becoming permanent. That's basically what happened here, but on a massive industrial scale. Now, before going further, let's be clear. These shadow factories weren't traditional factories at all, but the nickname stuck, and for good reason. This chapter in Boeing's story is a painful one, but importantly, it's now mostly in the past. And for Boeing, a company still struggling to rebuild trust worldwide, that's very good news. So, what were these places really? On August 12, 2025, a Boeing 737 MAX-28 lifted off from Moses Lake, Grant County International Airport, Washington. It wasn't carrying passengers. In fact, it wasn't even in service yet. The jet had a temporary registration number in 56807 and had actually been built way back in November 2019 at Boeing's Renton facility. Right after being built, the plane was flown to Moses Lake, and there it sat, untouched, for nearly 6 years. On that August morning, it finally left Washington for Victorville, California, where it will get a new paint job and a permanent registration, B20DJ, before being handed over to Air China, assuming politics don't interfere. So why does that flight matter? Because this aircraft was the very last stored 737 MAX to leave Moses Lake. For the first time since the 2019 groundings, Boeing had finally cleared its backlog of jets that had been sitting idle in long-term storage. But to understand the significance, we need to look at Moses Lake itself. This airfield's history stretches back to 1942, when it was first opened as Moses Lake Army Air Base. The base soon became a major training hub during World War II, including for Boeing B-17 bomber pilots. After the war, Boeing maintained a strong presence here. The very first B-47 jet bomber landed at Moses Lake, and later, the site supported testing for the B-52 and KC-135. By the 1960s, when the U.S. Air Force left and the base became a civilian airport, Boeing continued to use it for training commercial pilots. Many Japan Airlines 747 pilots trained there to fly the legendary Queen of the Skies. Over time, some of Boeing's hangars fell silent, serving mainly as storage for old equipment. That's how things stood until 2019, when the world changed for Boeing. As you know, the 737 MAX was grounded globally in March 2019 after 2 tragic crashes. The plane, involved in our story, built just months before that, was one of many jets parked at airports like Moses Lake, waiting for clearance to fly. And here's the key point. Those shadow factories like Moses Lake became full of brand new planes that airlines couldn't take delivery of. Boeing had effectively turned these airports into makeshift storage facilities. But this wasn't only about the 737 MAX. The 787 Dreamliner also had its own shadow storage sites, dealing with separate production and certification problems. So why did these shadow factories linger so long? The answer lies in Boeing's production pace. Before the MAX was grounded, Boeing was churning out 52 aircraft per month, with plans to hit 60. Even when regulators grounded the fleet worldwide, Boeing didn't immediately stop building new jets. That decision meant hundreds of planes rolled off the line with nowhere to go. The result? Entire airports became packed with grounded aircraft, sitting in rows like a ghost fleet. Fast forward to 2025. Boeing's production rate is capped at 38 aircraft per month by the FAA due to safety oversight after the infamous door plug blowout in 2024. But the departure of that final MAX from Moses Lake marks a turning point. For Boeing, it means those shadow factories, those costly symbols of failure, are finally closing their chapter in aviation history. You know that frustrating moment when you land in a new country and suddenly have no way to get online or message anyone unless you switch on roaming and rack up a huge bill. That used to be my reality. But now I use HoloFly, today's sponsor. And honestly, it's been a game changer. HoloFly provides global eSIMs that keep you connected in over 200 destinations. No more hunting for local SIM cards or worrying about outrageous roaming charges. With HoloFly, you get fast mobile data instantly, and you don't even need to remove your regular SIM card. Better yet, you can keep using your original number for calls while HoloFly handles your data. Perfect for both work and travel. The setup is simple. Just choose a plan that fits your trip. Activate it on your phone, and you're online in seconds. No more physical SIM swapping. No more stress. Right now, you can get 5% off standard eSIMs and 10% off monthly subscriptions. With the code MENTOR, just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description to try it out. Thanks again to HoloFly for supporting the channel. Now, let's get back to Boeing. So, how quickly did Boeing slow down production of the 737 MAX after the global grounding? Well, throughout much of 2019, they were still building about 42 aircraft per month. That's actually more than the 38 per month they allowed to make today under FAA restrictions. But here's the strange part. Why keep producing planes that no airline could legally fly? It comes down to money and logistics. Aircraft builders like Boeing get only a small deposit when an airline places an order. The real payment comes at delivery. With the MAX grounded, Boeing couldn't hand over jets, and therefore couldn't collect the bulk of the cash. That left them with two options, both painful. Option 1 was to halt production entirely. That would cut losses, but force Boeing to lay off or furlough thousands of skilled workers. Restarting later would have been a nightmare. Certifications would lapse, workflows would collapse, and suppliers across the industry would also be forced to slash staff. And remember, in 2019, the US economy was booming. Skilled engineers and mechanics were in short supply. If Boeing lost them, there was no guarantee they'd ever return. So, option 2 was to keep producing at a reduced but steady pace, enough to keep assembly lines alive and suppliers afloat. Boeing settled on 42 aircraft per month, even though they couldn't deliver a single one. Of course, this burned through enormous amounts of cash daily. And worse, it created a growing problem: where to put all those finished planes. At first, Boeing parked them around the Renton factory, but space ran out quickly, so jets were flown, flown to Boeing Field just a few miles away. Even there, lots filled up, car parks were converted into makeshift storage. And soon, that wasn't enough either. That's when airports like Moses Lake became Boeing's so-called shadow factories, entire fleets of brand new but undeliverable 737 MAX jets were lined up wingtip to wingtip, waiting for the grounding to end. Boeing's thinking was simple. Once regulators cleared the plane, they could deliver hundreds of aircraft in rapid succession, triggering a massive wave of payments and replenishing their finances. In theory, this would offset the staggering losses they had suffered during the grounding. But reality was messier. Even if jets were handed over in bulk, Boeing still owed airlines penalties for late delivery. And worse, some customers lost confidence in the MAX altogether, canceling orders they had placed years before. The biggest issue with Boeing's entire plan was simple: the grounding lasted far longer than anyone expected. In the early days, Boeing publicly hinted the 737 MAX could be back in service within just a few weeks. Had that been true, the storage headache would have been tough but manageable. By the spring of 2019, Boeing began flying newly built jets to Moses Lake, thinking it would be a temporary 6-month solution. Instead, those planes sat there for over 6 years. But even before it became clear how long the crisis would drag on, Boeing knew the challenge wasn't only about parking space. These aircraft required constant care and upkeep. And those old hangars at Moses Lake, originally built for B-52 bombers, suddenly became very useful. Here's why. Aircraft maintenance is partly based on usage flight hours and flight cycles, but also on calendar time. Even if a jet never leaves the ground, certain inspections, updates, and part replacements are still required on a strict schedule. For example, windows needed to be covered to protect interiors from UV damage. Fuel and hydraulic systems had to be preserved with special fluids. Electronics required regular power-ups and software updates. Planes had to be kept ready in case Boeing needed to reposition them or prepare them for delivery. In short, long-term storage became a massive maintenance operation. At the peak, Moses Lake held around 250 grounded 737s, and Boeing employed nearly 1,000 workers just to maintain them. That's why the company itself jokingly called the place a shadow factory. In reality, the scale of work resembled a full-fledged assembly or overhaul facility. And Moses Lake wasn't the only one. Boeing set up similar sites in San Antonio, Texas, and Victorville, California. But Moses Lake was both the first to open and the last to shut down. Of course, all of this came at a huge financial cost. Boeing initially reassured the public that the MAX would be cleared before the end of 2019. But as weeks turned into months, this optimistic messaging only strained their already rocky relationship with the FAA, the very authority that had to sign off on the aircraft's return. For decades, the FAA's certification was seen globally as beyond question. But after the MAX crashes, that trust eroded. International regulators began scrutinizing Boeing and the FAA far more closely, refusing to simply accept American approvals at face value. As 2020 approached with no resolution in sight, Boeing's board lost patience. CEO Dennis Muilenburg was fired, and in December 2019, Boeing finally halted MAX production altogether. That meant the company endured the worst of both worlds: 10 months of burning cash while producing planes they couldn't deliver, followed by the massive disruption of a production shutdown. Restarting later would be slow and painful. Meanwhile, the thousands of jets sitting in storage still needed attention. Crews had to implement every software patch and hardware modification demanded by regulators before the planes could fly again. But even after approval, there was another complication. Boeing had expected to hand over hundreds of jets in bulk once the grounding lifted. Instead, the FAA required individual inspections for each aircraft, done by its own staff rather than Boeing's. That bottleneck meant deliveries crawled along, not just during the grounding, but for years afterward, well into the recovery from the pandemic. And Boeing's Shadow Factory story wasn't limited to the 737. The company also had a separate site, dedicated to the 787 Dreamliner, though in that case it operated inside an existing Boeing plant. When Boeing shifted all 787 Dreamliner production to its facility in North Charleston, South Carolina, the company repurposed the space at its Everett plant for a different purpose, inspecting already built 787s for manufacturing defects. This tied back to the long-standing issue with how the 787 fuselage barrels were joined together, something we've explored in other videos. Fixing these problems required such extensive disassembly and rework that the process often took longer than building the jets in the first place. The problem surfaced in the summer of 2020, and according to reporting by Dominic Gates, Boeing didn't finally shut down its 787 Shadow facility until early 2025, nearly 5 years later. Closing these sites was a major milestone. Even when the floor space itself wasn't urgently needed, the work tied up hundreds of skilled employees who could have been used in more productive areas. Today, many of those workers have been reassigned minus 787 specialists to other projects, and maintenance crews from Moses Lake now moving over to Renton to help assemble new 737s. But that transition hasn't been smooth. Some employees simply didn't want to leave Moses Lake, which many describe as a great place to live. After 5 years, a number of them had settled down, bought homes, and moved their families there. And while Boeing has now cleared out its last stored 737 MAX 8 South and MAX 9 South from Moses Lake, the story isn't over. There are still undelivered jets waiting in storage. Specifically, Boeing hasn't yet secured certification for the MAX 7, the smallest version, or the MAX 10, the largest. According to John Ostrower at the Air Current, delays with fixes to the engine anti-eye system could push certification of these models to 2026. At the moment, Boeing is believed to have around 35 MAX 7, South, and MAX 10s in storage, and those numbers are likely to rise until approval is granted. Meanwhile, several 777-9 South remain parked at Everett, with Boeing still targeting certification by the end of 2025. If achieved, that would be a critical win. So while the Shadow Factory era for the MAX may be closing, Boeing will still need large teams dedicated to maintaining undelivered aircraft for the foreseeable future. And beyond that, the company must prepare for a ramp-up in production, including plans for a new 737 MAX assembly line at Everett, pending FAA approval. That said, the delivery of the very last stored, certified 737 MAX from Moses Lake is a huge symbolic moment for Boeing, one worth celebrating. Of course, geopolitics also plays a role here. The final 20 MAX jets from Moses Lake went to Chinese airlines. US-China trade tensions may have only affected part of that batch, but they remain a significant risk factor for both deliveries and future orders. It's a storyline worth keeping an eye on. So, had you heard about Boeing's so-called shadow factories before today? And what do you think Boeing's biggest challenge will be in the months ahead? Let me know in the comments. As for me, I'm heading into another Patreon hangout, where I'll be answering your questions directly. If you'd like to join in, scan the QR code or visit patreon.com/joinment. And don't forget to check out today's sponsor below. It really helps keep this channel going.